Hello everybody, today I want to talk about 5 recent mechanics that I consider to be the worst. These are mechanics that didn't play well, were executed poorly, or maybe just unnecessary. Just because I don't like their implementation now, doesn't mean I wouldn't like to have them back, maybe after a bit of tweaking. Well, let's go ahead and take another look at the top 5 worst recent mechanics before Modern Horizons 3. The first worst mechanic is Saddle from Thunder Junction. Magic has needed some kind of mount mechanic for a long time. There's just a vast amount of design space and ways to flavorfully represent riding a creature. Mounts are a big trope and a class in a lot of other media and video games, and it's great that Magic finally has a way to represent them in-game, especially such a long time after we have rideable craft in the form of vehicles. However, this implementation felt very mediocre and underwhelming in execution. When you saddle a creature, it does literally nothing by itself. If you tap one or more creatures and pay the saddle cost, nothing inherently happens. What does cause the abilities to happen on mount creatures is an additional paragraph of rules text. Why couldn't the saddling have its own effect? It could have boosted the power and toughness of the mount creature to make it more likely to survive combat. Let's look at Seraphic Steed as an example. You tap your creature to saddle it, then you have to attack with the saddled creature with kind of underwhelming stats, hope that your 2/2 first strike survives combat, and that it was worth it to tap your 4-power creature instead of attacking with it to make an angel token. Most mount creatures are stuck on the ground with no evasion. The payoffs from tapping a creature and removing it from attacking or blocking for the turn cycle are a lot of times not worth it. Most of the best saddle creatures do something when they aren't saddled. The Gitrog Ravenous Ride is an undercosted 6/5 with haste and trample, and the saddle payoff is actually worth your time since it draws cards and ramps. Ornery Tumblewag distributes counters automatically at the beginning of combat, and then the saddle payoff is reasonable if you get it to go off on the right board state. If it didn't pass out counters without saddling, it would be a pretty weak card. Archmage's Newt does a Snapcaster Mage impression without being saddled, which is useful, but it's likely to be one time because of its small stats and lack of evasion. Calamity Galloping Inferno can go infinite with an extra combat creature like Bloodthirster or Portraiser if you keep Calamity alive. Calamity is one of the cards that Saddle works best with since it makes 2 copies of a creature and you don't have to risk the creature in combat. Fortune Loyal Steed is a kind of frail similar version of this, but you have to hope the underwhelming 2/4 attacker survives if you want to do it more than once. Most of the other saddle creatures are very weak, the payoffs aren't worth it, and you have to tap creatures for small, non-evasive creatures to get a middling effect. I think saddle could have been so much better. It could have boosted the creature equal to its saddle cost as part of the mechanic. A saddle 2 creature could have got +2/+2 until end of turn. Or they could have made a specific creature that became unblockable if you saddled it. Or some kind of other benefit that makes it less of a small creature attacking into a likely board of blockers that'll trade with or kill it. If they brought Saddle back and pushed the power level just a bit more, or even made it more interesting, it could become a mechanic that most of us would be happy to play with. The next mechanic I thought was a bit of a dud were Cases from Martyrs at Karlov Manor. Cases are a kind of enchantment that didn't make a huge splash, but there are still a few useful ones. You play the case, and it does something, then you have to meet a requirement to solve the case, and then the enchantment gains a new ability. They're a bit fidgety and by necessity require 3 lines of text, but luckily they didn't make each ability into novels. The number of words on them is still high, but it could have been a lot worse. The number of words contribute to the complexity of the cards, and cases are already complex by their very nature, just like sagas. I think the usefulness of the cases were inhibited by the power level of the set they were printed in, Karlov Manor. It was a bit of a lower powered set compared to some of the other recent standard sets, and was kind of a slower and mana intensive set because it had to match the power level of Disguise, a slower and mana intensive mechanic. The big reason that cases are on this list is because they're confusing to understand when you first encounter them. I remember seeing previews for cases and people didn't understand how solving them worked. The short sentence of reminder text, if unsolved, solve at the beginning of your end step, seemed a bit ambiguous, and many people required a simple explanation of how it worked to understand it. Nothing on the cards makes it clear whether the first ability remains if you solve the case. When the case is solved was ambiguous, since you could meet the solve requirement during combat or earlier. To solve sort of implies that when you meet the condition, the case would be solved, as opposed to at the end of turn. It was just a little confusing. Most players know how they work now by word of mouth or reading the release notes or rulings, but I think it can be difficult for some players to know how the cards work without outside information that's not printed on the card. I think extra confusing mechanics and required knowledge not printed on the card are bad for the game. It makes it more difficult for new players to feel comfortable when they're learning the game and to understand how already complex interactions work, and it makes it more easy that they become frustrated and overwhelmed by a massive amount of complexity to be able to play. The next mechanic I thought was a problem was Discover from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. I know what you're thinking, but wait, Discover is a great mechanic, it's powerful. It's Cascade, but even better. And that's exactly why I think it was unnecessary. I don't know how people could play with Cascade cards and think, you know what this broken mechanic needs? To be power crept. Discover is Cascade, but the mana values you discover into can be variable, unlike Cascade. And you can choose not to cast the spell you discover into and instead put it in your hand. With Cascade, if you cascade it into a counterspell or something else you couldn't cast effectively, you would just have to choose not to cast it and shuffle it back into the cards that go into the bottom. Now you can just put the card in your hand instead. Extra value. Cascade was already a broken mechanic, with lots of deck archetypes being serious contenders in internal formats. Cheating on mana cost and casting spells for free are two of the most unbalanced and powerful mechanics in the game. Cascade has fueled Living End, Crashing Footfalls, and even required WotC to change their rules because of being able to cheat split and MDFC cards, like Tibalt Cosmic Imposter. Cascade was not a mechanic that needed any extra help. Not being able to cast the counterspell you cascaded into was the risk you take when playing with such an overpowered mechanic. Something that bothers me about Magic design like this too is invalidating cards that synergize with one mechanic by renaming them. Cascade synergies, like Averna the Chaos Bloom, don't synergize with Discover cards, and Curator of Sun's Creation doesn't work with Cascade cards. If you want to build a deck with both mechanics, since they're basically the same thing, you're going to run into duds like these that don't synergize with half your deck. I don't think the benefit of being able to put the discovered card into your hand was enough of a benefit to rename an entire mechanic, instead of working with the perfectly fine previous one. Having renamed mechanics that just have a tiny variance to them also adds to the complexity creep of the game, and all these little extra things to learn can really pile up and be confusing to new players. Having Disguise alongside Morph and Manifest alongside Cloak makes it all just a little extra confusing for less enfranchised players and don't offer enough of a benefit. The next mechanic to talk about is Celebration from Wilds of Eldraine. Celebration, while probably working well for Limited, is pretty clunky and unreliable in Commander. Being able to consistently make 2 non-land permanents isn't easy to do for most decks, and when you are able to do it consistently, like with Semester's End, do you really want to be doing it to enable Celebration cards when you could just be blinking big value creatures like Muldrifter or Agent of Treachery? I think Celebration could actually work, but the cards that had Celebration on them were just woefully underpowered. I know Godric Cloaked Reveler saw standard play, but he's a lot more questionable in Commander. Lady of Laughter should theoretically be good, but in decks that want to play 2 permanents in a turn, you don't really want to be tapping out for a clunky 5-mana spell to get your card draw. I honestly think Raging Battle Mouse has potential to be playable in some decks, but definitely not because of the Celebration effect. The only real selling point is the mana cost reduction, which I think can have legs. And Celebration doesn't even trigger on opponents' turns. If you could play Celebration cards in an Ithara God of the Polis style deck and get the Celebration effects up to 4 turns per cycle, it could have been better. But the real problem was the payoffs for triggering Celebration are simply not worth it outside of Limited. Getting a +1/+1 counter on your Ash Party Crasher once per turn, or drawing a card once per turn cycle sometimes on your 5-drop just isn't worth it. The effects were a little too safe for my liking. The last mechanic I want to talk about isn't a mechanic. It's actually like 4 mechanics. What a bargain. It's Descended, Descend 4, Descend 8, and Fathomless Descent from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. This group of mechanics care about how many permanent cards go to your graveyard from anywhere that turn, or they care about the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. You have to read each card to find out. Descend, I think, is a pretty good mechanic. It differentiates itself from just plain old aristocrat style ghost to graveyard triggers by not counting tokens and by counting cards that get milled or discarded. That's cool. That's a useful shorthand. And useful shorthand is something cards can definitely use when possible. Do you remember reading Sir Conrad the Grim the first time? I know they don't do exactly the same thing, but reading a card with Descend, like Molten Collapse, is so much more pleasant than reading a block of text with seemingly unrelated triggers like on Sir Conrad. I think the problem was with keywording other things, like caring about the number of permanent cards in your graveyard with such similar wording. When you descend, or if you descend, is simple enough to understand. But then something completely unrelated, like the number of permanents in your graveyard, instead of triggering when permanents go to the graveyard, and then using the same word makes it confusing for new players. They could have made two keywords with different sounding names to make it clear they did different things. Fathomless Descent is a cute name that's pretty similar to Descend. Maybe that's different enough. But then you have cards that say Descend 4 or Descend 8, which is exactly the same word as the other mechanic, but it's something different. And they aren't even actually shorthand, because the cards that say Descend 4 then go on to explain exactly what Descend 4 is. Not in reminder text that you can erase in other printings, but the actual rules text. Making Descend 4 and 8 into keywords actually makes the rules text longer than if they just left it off. In my opinion, that was a bizarre choice, and the descendable mechanics were executed poorly. That said, I think Descend itself is a great mechanic that I'd like to see return. In fact, all of these mechanics are worth revisiting, but maybe with a few tweaks to make them work a bit better. What do you think? Do you have a different opinion about these mechanics? Was I just complaining about one of your favorites? Or is there a different recent mechanic that you thought was far worse? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, give it a like and subscribe to the channel to get notified for more Magic content. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.